Hello, PDIE Future Lunchers. Thank you so much for inviting me today to share with you some thoughts on the future of education. Please forgive me in advance. In the spirit of Mark Twain, I tried to make a short presentation, but I didn't quite have the time to submit a longer one. It is also, of course, a huge topic and a very important one, and I think crucial one for our future, and really for the future of the evolution of humanity. And when we think about evolution, it's been going on and on and on, and here we are at the 3.5 billion year mark, and we've made it this far. Great. And we're at a transformation point, so it's a good time to take a step back and actually look at our reflection. Where are we at? Right? We look at the world and we see climate change and resource scarcity as issues, partly propagated by our own, at least exacerbated by our own thoughtlessness. We see global shift in economic power, and not just between countries or different ecosystems of wealth, but also inside of countries and really between individuals in this ever-increasing income gap that we're seeing around the world, which at this point is really ridiculous if you think about it. And we have, of course, because of that, demographic and social changes over the next couple of years, massive ones with generation shifts, whole new populations from different places of the world coming in, because we're also facing global migrations. What we've seen so far with displaced individuals hasn't even been the beginning of it yet. And with climate change, with economic crises, with political changes, all those will see a lot more displaced people. And even inside of countries as well, we'll see a movement towards even more urbanization for a moment at least. And all of this is, of course, happening in the context of technological innovation. When people talk about the future of education, the first thing that comes up, of course, is technology, right, and AI. And Aristotle talked about this sort of interplay between episteme and techne, right, between our consciousness and the technologies we create as a result of this level of consciousness, and then those technologies in turn shifting our consciousness again, so that we are advancing and can then create even better technologies going forward. So there's this constant interplay between us and our technologies. And if you look at that, of course, that brings up the question, what makes us human, right? Especially in an age of AI. And if you look at what technology has done so far, it's replaced a lot of us. And if I look at a more basic level of, here is my body and I can move things from point A to point B, right, the basics of a worker in quotation marks, well, we have machines that can do that better. We've seen automation in factories for decades now. We've seen robots there. Here is Hadrian 10. It's a bricklaying robot that's about 3 to 4 times as fast as a normal human bricklayer. It's obvious that we're already continuously advancing on those levels of taking care of that physical activity that we used to do as humans with machines. Right? But of course, we have emotions, right? We're so special as humans. Well, even there, facial recognition and voice recognition are actually much more reliable at this point already than most psychologists in discovering, for example, if you have depression issues. They can see that from your voice, or from tone of voice, or from microfacial expressions. That takes psychologists years to train on and be able to recognize. And AI can do that and can do it much faster and better every single day. So even on this lower emotional level, AI is already above us in terms of what it can do. Of course, then we have a mind, right? We can think, we can be logical, right? We can solve algorithms and logic. Well, if we're really honest, every pocket calculator is ultimately already much better at that than most humans are. Unless you, off the top of your head, know the square root of 4,572,200,021. The calculator could have done that in a fraction of the time that you can do this in. And this, of course, is not just the basic algorithms, it's even those complicated things like being a lawyer, right, where you have to understand contracts and language. Well, this was an experiment where Logi put themselves up against some lawyers, and they had 5 NDAs to look at. And the lawyers, took about 92 minutes in average to complete this task, and they had an accuracy of 85%. Well, the AI did that too in 26 seconds with an accuracy of 94%. There's a lot of these knowledge jobs, right? Doctor, lawyer, finance person, right? All these different great jobs that we used to have that you struggled for in college in order to get into. Well, they're going to be replaced by AI first because they're more expensive than a line worker in a factory. Right? So I think, therefore, I am, Descartes' famous, quote, might not be sufficient anymore in order to really think about what makes us humans, as we now see ourselves in this reflection of technology, where robots can do better physical work, and AI can do, to some extent, better emotional work, at least in discovery, and AI can do much, much better work in a lot of those typical algorithm solution things that we made ourselves so proud of for being human. That's going away. That's not sufficient anymore. It's not going away, but it's at least not sufficient anymore to really discover what it means to be human. So what is our next human evolution, if that's the case? And how do we prepare our workforce for it, right, around the world, with very different degrees of infrastructure around education to begin with, right? How do we educate our workforce and bring them up to speed for all these new things we need to know? And how do we prepare our young? Even more important, right? You can measure the quality of a society by how they treat their young. And I would say, venture to say, not a lot of countries right now in the world really are doing such a great job at that. Right? Where there's so many more interesting topics in the current moment or for the elderly than there are actually for the young. And to understand all that, we have to look a little bit into historical context and really in how we do everything. How do we learn? Right? On a basic level, if you think about it, we start off with not knowing anything, we're just trying to do something for the first time. Right? We're muddling through, all hands on deck. We have no systems that we're just trying something for the first time. Right? And we occasionally, eventually get to repeatability. Right? We are able to say, oh, this happens all the time, and we're going to create kind of a process for this. Right? And then, of course, we begin to have functional excellence, and we begin to optimize this process. And we're like, oh, yeah, I can do something with that. Right? And we really optimize it, and we integrate more systems, and we become quantitatively managed. Right? And then, of course, we go into learning and say, okay, now that I understand the system, I've optimized it, what can I do better? Right? And we keep learning and expanding and integrating even more further into, okay, what can I do with this outside of this, right? All the way to creating dynamic systems continuously. And for each of these different things are kind of necessary. Right? And we can look at them historically too. We had these hunter-gatherer societies who ran around and followed the paths of the, game that they're hunting. But they had no necessarily repeatable process. They had basic repeatable processes around these, functions of the hunt. Right? Then we have, of course, had repeatability when we began to have agriculture, when we settled down and we began to do things repeatedly and in, cycles of nature. And we kept going back and, to doing the same things again and again. Right? And then, of course, we had the automation of that, and we said, oh, let's have a factory for this, right? And let's have automation for starting in agriculture, then expanding into manufacturing, and now ultimately being the basis of how we live modern life. Right? And within that, of course, we get to then optimize that, which has been sort of, especially the last 50 years or so, where we've looked at these machines and we've studied factories and we've really looked at how can we optimize them continuously. And here we are at the current threshold. And in each of them, kind of a different thing was there, right? Survival was there for hunter-gatherers. Repeatability was a key theme for the agricultural societies. Growth and expansion was a big part of the, industrial era. And you think about the British Tea Company, for example, just to give you one example of growth and expansion, setting the foundation for what we now look at as international organizations. Right, and of course the optimization age, right? Continuously optimizing for numbers, for your financial metrics, as we've seen it especially since the takeover in the 90s. And here we have the current threshold, and now we're moving into the next evolution, right? We're moving into dynamically expansive experiments, right? If you look at brands like Amazon, for example, they're continuously experimenting, expanding into new areas, right? We have better integrative solutions, healthier solutions for our planet, new supply chains, right? And ultimately create, in continuous evolution, more and more meaningful outcomes. But we're not there yet, right? We have to get past that current threshold first. And in that current threshold, there's different leadership that goes into each of these stages. I'm not going to go too much into that, but we need different personal capacities to lead in each of these stages. And if we ask the World Economic Forum, what do we need in the future? This is their list of 2025 skills for the future of work. Right? And if you look at them, there's innovation, there's learning, there's problem solving, there's analysis, there's resilience, creativity, ideation, like emotional stuff, and a little bit of technology, but nothing in there at the end. But none of those things really are about knowledge. Right? When you think about education, you tend to think knowledge. It's not about knowledge or having knowledge. It's actually about the ability to acquire knowledge and to solve meaningful things with it. Right? That's what the top skills are for the future. Acquiring knowledge, not having knowledge. Right? For that, we have to really think about all this. If people think about this upskilling, right? If you go by 2025, we need to upskill 50% of our workforce, or even 80% of the workforce, depending on which statistics you look at. Right? But we don't need to upskill people. We need to transform them towards a culture of learning. And this is where really education comes in, and I want to make the distinction here between instruction on the one hand and education on the other hand. Both have their valid place, right? But I think we had forgot about education and got a little too excited about instructions, especially since the advent of factories. And instruction is literally meaning putting a structure in, right? I'm putting a structure into the child that I'm working with. Versus education, ducere in Latin means to pull, right? Educare means to pull out their genius, pull out their uniqueness, pull out their gifts and talents. And instruction is about training people in skills. So you need to now learn how to program in AI, right? Education is about activating capacities and making it fun to learn around these things and solving problems using AI, right? Where AI becomes a capacity, not a skill, a tool that you use to build and create. And of course, instruction is very much based on this extrinsic motivation, right? You better learn this if you want to get a good job, right? You better study hard if you want to get into a good school, right? You better be good in that good school if you want to go get a good job afterwards, right? Extrinsically motivated. You better work hard to get that bonus at the end of the year. Again, extrinsically motivated. Now, in education, it's really about creating intrinsic motivation. Right? When you think about Rudolf Steiner, he said, where's the book in which a teacher can read about what teaching is? The children themselves are this book, right? We should not learn to teach off any book other than the one line open before us, consisting of the children themselves. That is education, pulling out what's inside the child. Right? And I would venture to say that education is really about creating momentum towards continuous learning. Right? Creating that moment, getting those kids started into a lifelong journey of discovery and of exploration. And we say this about creating intrinsic motivation. Well, there's three primary criteria according to self-determination theory. Right? Relatedness, competence, and autonomy. If I have those three factors present, if I feel connected to it, if I feel confident around being able to do something here, and I'm learning and I'm okay with that kind of growth edge, and I have a sense of autonomy of who I am, if I have those three things and how this serves me, right? If I have those three things present, I actually have intrinsic motivation. And a lot of times when people look for purpose, they're actually not looking for purpose. They're looking for intrinsic motivation. They're looking for a reason to get up in the morning and be excited about their day. And isn't that what we would want for our children? So I have three things that I think relate to those five factors of intrinsic motivation that I think are key to the future of education. The first is to change the objective. Right? Education is not about getting a job. Right? Education is about creating the future, and we need to shift all of the institutional learning, schools, primary education, secondary education, workforce learning inside of organizations, because now employers, the most important thing that they can do is actually train and upskill and up-level their workforce, right? Because that's their primary asset, right? Workforce education and governmental education for the people who need to shift now in a rapidly shifting economy. Right? So that kind of institutional learning, in my mind, gets to be focused on creating the future. Right? All these kids who sat there and go, why do I need to learn math? Well, they didn't have a problem to solve that math could help them with. Right? If we have concrete problems, if we orient and make the focus of our learning not about getting a job or some stupid vocational training, but about creating the future, we have a completely different motivation with children. Right? Because we live on one planet. Right? We live on a spaceship that's actually burning. We live in a burning spaceship. We can't just step outside. We need lots of new solutions fast. And who better to build those solutions than our learners? And in that, we need to instill this expanded spheres of concern and influence in those children, right? Where it's not just about the individual, it's about these one-on-one relationships, about team, right? About taking care of the organization and the nation, the ecosystem, and ultimately the whole planet. Every one of us, by default, is concerned there. It is our traumas. It is those times when we heard as kids that it's not for us, we're not old enough for that, we're not smart enough for that, that we decided to shrink. And Google found out that the key performance indicator for high-performing teams is psychological safety. And it's the same here. Right? For the child who feels safe, they're going to expand the sphere of concern. They're going to be curious to learn more about other things. And they're going to concern themselves with and try to influence them in a positive way. If I'm in fear, if I'm in scarcity, if my amygdala is activated, my limbic system, I'm barely going to take care of myself. So we need to make it safe for children to learn and expand and grow in their curiosity. And we need to do this together. Right? This is where we're learning together. We have to also figure out how can we learn together better. And I call it tribal learning here. This is about the second largest human creation, at least a couple of years ago, after Wikipedia, was the manual to World of Warcraft. People learning together, adding value together, sharing experience with each other. This sharing experience is so important, and it's really important here to remember that none of us really knows what's going on. Nobody knows what the future will hold. We only have our own perspective. There's a beautiful story in Eastern lore about blind man and the elephant, right? Where a bunch of blind men encounter an elephant, and the first one thinks it's a wall, and the second thinks it's a tree, and the third thinks it's a palm tree, and they actually get in a fist fight about who's right. We have to stop thinking that we are right. Right? That's the realm of instruction. I get the right information, and you better do what I tell you to do. Right? Instead of perspective, and saying, hey, from over here I can see this, what do you see from over there? Right? And if you share that, and if you learn to interact with each other in new ways, then we can actually create together. We have to remember that culture is an emergent phenomenon. Culture happens in the spaces in between us, in between our interactions. Right? Each one of us creates ripples. And then these overlays of how we show up and how we relate to each other, that's how we determine how we operate as a society, as a company, as a family, as an individual. And this brings me to the individual itself, right? To really instill in children the fascination for creating themselves. Right? Because creating the future and being part of that grand adventure creates a sense of belonging, like relatedness. Learning together and supporting each other in our growth and having the tools to support each other in our growth creates a sense of competence. And creating yourself and really knowing that this is about your life creates that sense of autonomy. And if we want to create outcomes, we have to change our behaviors. Right? We have certain behaviors to create those outcomes. And if we want to have those behaviors, we have to have a mindset that makes those behaviors the ones we choose. If we want to dig deeper into that, I usually talk about awareness as a context of, or mindset as a progression of awareness, right? The things that I'm becoming aware of, the things I'm taking in, the things I'm taking responsibility for as a result of that, and ultimately the ownership I have in order over my life, over my relationships. The goal being to be more and more ownership of life, of my life, of the life around me, of reality around me. And the more capable I am, the more capable I am around creating outcomes in the world around me. And it's a process. Buckminster Fuller said, I seem to be a verb. We're in constant movement. We've taught people this stupid non-thinking that I am that. Well, I'm now a trained engineer. Now I should know. Right? You don't know. You're still learning. You have some engineering skills. Great. But it doesn't define you. It's actually constantly changing, constantly exercising. That's the key here. The old Greeks had a word for it called ascesis. And when we think about ascetics today, when we think about this tiny little guy who was, not eating for days and was going for severe, training to harden himself and become self-disciplined. But ascesis is not about that. It's about a culture of practicing. Right? Peter Sloterdijk, a German philosopher, this recent book, das sein Leben ändern, called it an Übungskultur, an exercising culture, a culture of constantly reaching for what is up and above us. Like Nietzsche talked about, between man and Superman, in this tension field, where we orient ourselves on the highest potential. That's what's important. So what are we exercising in this? Is it just our muscles? We've actually taken the word aesthetic and kind of limited it, according to Sloterdijk, to the athlete and the spiritual practitioner. But we really want to create an exercising culture. And to that, I have to go back to Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was one of the originator of public education in Germany. And he talked about how there are certain kinds of knowledge that must be of general nature, and more importantly, a certain cultivation of the mind and character that nobody can do without. He says that people cannot be good craft workers, merchants, soldiers, or businessmen unless they're also good, outstanding, and well-informed human beings and citizens. Right? And if this is based as this laid the foundation in school, vocational training is easy to acquire later. Right? And the person is always free to move from one occupation to another, as happens so often in life. And this was back in the day, in the age of enlightenment. You already saw it coming. But he's saying, don't worry about what you're learning for your job. Learn to build your character, learn to build your mind. And of course, his efforts in bringing this education to Germany were thwarted by the advent of factories. Because once we had factories, we suddenly needed large amounts of compliant workers, and compliant consumers who would consume and buy all those extra products that the factory made that we didn't really actually need. Right? Hashtag plastic, look around it, of how many things we actually don't need. Right? But we developed a whole new system. We developed those schools around that. Right, on instructing them with the basics the kids need to know so that they can do the work they need to do. And if they're a little smarter, they get a white collar. If they're a little dumber, they get a blue collar. Right? What a system. Right? But it was serving the time. It was serving the time of the factories. And all those kids who are comparing who's got which phone, like, and were being marketed to as babies already these days, right? So that they can be compliant consumers of unnecessary goods afterwards. So this kind of ruined that whole education system and turned it into factory education, focused on instruction and vocational training. And we, on the other hand, always had maps of what it means to be a human. Right? This is Pythagoras talking about octaves, right? Or we had the quadrivium and the trivium, the different ways of noble arts, of really learning logic and rhetorics and all those different things. We had maps like alchemy that talked about the different stages the alchemists go through, which are really just thinly veiled psychological processes, psychological training, in those cases, practice plan. And we've had this, in different cultures around the world. We've had chakras in the East, we've had the Kabbalah and Judaism, which majorly influenced the European culture in the 17th and 18th century as well. We've had, the I Ching in China, we've had, age-old systems that talk about these maps of how we function as humans. Just the staff of Caduceus, Hermes' staff, the God messenger who brings the knowledge of the gods to humans. We have it in Christianity in Jacob's ladder, right, which is something the Templars learned when they were in the Crusades in the Middle East and brought back, which explained their rise to power and ultimately their fall because they were advancing as individuals, which did not quite sit well with the church at the time. So hence Friday the 13th. We've had the Masons, we have Rosicrucians, we've had different societies and secret societies that have always taught what it means to be a human and how we can activate and fully activate our capacity as a human. We find that later, of course, as Steiner, who I've quoted earlier, right, he looked at these 7-year cycles in which we grow. Right? In the first 7 years, we have essentially the basic foundation of our operating system installed. In the next 7 years, we decide and figure out where we want to move in this and who we want to be, and so on. We also see, of course, in the esoteric that continues with people like Crowley and later Timothy Leary, who took those things and was also a synthesizer and brought together all these different approaches. And we have it in Piaget, who was looking at the development of children. And he was coming from an observational perspective. So curious enough, he'd actually validated a lot of these things that we've had models for and maps for thousands of years. And also we have it in the East in Sri Aurobindo, who created integral yoga, similarly looking at how can we activate the whole human, because we thought that evolutionary consciousness was the primary evolution we needed now. And of course, we find it in Ken Willer's integral theory, who are also a fantastic systems synthesizer, right, who took a lot of these different approaches and looked at how can we make a model out of this. And I like this very simple model of chakras because I grew up with yoga, but again, the map is not the territory, as Alfred Korzybski said, who was the founder of modern linguistics. Right? So it's just a map. But we can all probably agree that we have this body, right? We have a body with which we can sense, we have emotions with which you can feel. We have a mind with which you can think, right? And this is sort of that, I think, therefore I am. Right? When we get to that stage, we begin to actually abhor emotions and the body, and said that was for women, for children, and for animals, and for plants. Right? But the rational man was so much better. Right? Little did you know, it was not a hierarchy, but a holarchy. Right? And we actually need to integrate all of those circuits inside of us. And of course, we have more, because as humans, we have relationships, right? Thinking can now be done by AI, but the AI is not there to tell us what we value. Right? The AI can look at patterns and can look at things, but it doesn't know what's right and what's wrong, what's desirable and what's not desirable. That is something we need to teach them. We need to teach those adversarial genetic networks what to look for, right? Which area to go into, and what to optimize for. Because otherwise we're optimized purely for the memory of the past, in which case we get more of the current, which is already not working, which will be our doom. Right? So as we clear out our relationships and really learn how we choose things and make agreements with things. And it's sort of our existential part. And here it makes the most sense to be instructional, right? Because you're telling our children, hey, this is what you're going to need to survive in this world. Right? You need to eat and learn about your body and food. You need to learn about emotions and how you deal with other people. You need to learn about thinking and logic so you can structure reality. Right? When people talk about programming, it's not about learning programming. You're going to be a programmer. But it's an exercise in logic and an exercise in understanding how we can break down reality in logical ways. Right? We need to, here it makes sense to some extent to focus on that part. When we have no right to tell them or instruct them who to be, is this other part of the tribe. The creative part of their voice, their expression, right? Their vision, their imagination, and their own calling to create. Right? Their creative part is such that is what they are the authority. I just said earlier, they are the book we need to look at, and we as educators can only support them on their path, give them some tools for discovery, give them tools for along the way. But this is their journey to discover their genius to bring to the world. And of course, you also need to make sure that they have their needs met, because if they don't have their needs met, that's going to be very hard. But there's a beautiful saying about, teach a man to fish, or give him a fish or teach him how to fish. But if you are really hungry, it's hard to learn, right? So give the man a fish first and then teach him how to fish, right? And so in the early days, we are there to ensure the survival of our young, ensure their safety, ensure their self-esteem, that they're feeling good about themselves, ensure their social integration, right? And give them the tools for the path of self-actualization. You see Maslow's things here, of course, Maslow's needs that we talked about. Right? And finally, the idea of self-transcendence, when you realize that self-actualization is still an ego trip, like my voice, until we realize that everybody's voice matters, and we need to bring all the voices to the table right now to create good solutions. And finally, the meaning, right? Quest for meaning. Viktor Frankl comes up to mind here. Really, the humans, man's quest for meaning, humanity's quest for meaning. And really looking at why am I here, making it purposeful. And it also goes with new human capacities. We need to now learn how to now navigate this new space, this 21st century, this age of VUCA. Right? We need to become more adaptable. Right? And mens sana and corpore sano, as the old woman said, right? A healthy mind is in a healthy body. If my body is not flexible and adaptable, and electricity can't flow from my brain to the rest of my body because my spine is tightened up or calcified, doesn't make for very healthy thinking. Right? And so I need to stay adaptable and flexible, and teaching kids that it's important to stay in your body and be connected to your body. Not that so that you can compete in football, but that so you can be yourself fully and experience the pleasure of sensory pleasure of being in a human body in the first place. Right? And keeping it strong, keeping it mobile, keeping it enduring. Teaching them how to have empathy and understand these emotional swamplands that we work with as humans. Right? Because human relationships are messy. We need to learn how to navigate them. We need to teach them how to learn and how to think and how to really structure their thought, how to take in information, process information, aware of their own cognitive biases, and be very discerning in the information that they share. So much of what is shared today on social media is crap. Right? And we need to make sure that we are accountable, and we teach them how to be accountable, how to hold each other accountable, to be the kind of humans we would want to be here. To teach them about integrity, teach them about agreements, and especially if we're going to use technologies like blockchain that are all based on defined agreements, you have to understand what we're agreeing to in the first place. To be very, very clear on those agreements. And of course, give them the joy of their own expression. Right? We all have that creative gift. Right? Some people can draw better than others, but you can learn to draw better and better. Right? And yet, you can express yourself in so many ways. Today we have more of a palette available than ever. You can draw something in VR, in 3D, and print it and have it printed up in a 3D printer afterwards. That's doable today. And of course, strengthen their capacity to self-regulate, right? To continue to focus towards a vision, and in focusing towards that vision, adopt new good habits, get rid of habits that don't serve any longer, and create habits by being an habitual being. Right? So that they are self-regulating all these other aspects of themselves, their body, their emotions, their mind, continuously towards a vision of themselves in the future that they want to create. And ultimately self-organize, right? Teaching the agency to make things happen. Today we can connect and band together, and in days form teams, in hours form teams, and create solutions. That's doable now. So we have to teach them the tools to do that. And it's a bit of a radical revolution. Right? And when I say radical, I mean we need to go to the root, right? Radix, and that means root. And really rethink, why are we even worried about education? Are we just trying to get the next worker educated so they can pull the right levers and buy the right products? Or are we really seeing the value of education? We understand that as a civilization, it's our primary responsibility to take care of our future, by taking care of our young. Let's say revolution is a different kind of revolution. In the past, many revolutions have been about changing the environment in order to change the individual. But that's why revolutions became bloody, and why so many transformation projects and organizations fail, because they're trying to change the structure to force the individual into something new. Educational reforms, failures. So I invite you to start thinking about a different kind of revolution, the kind that Aldous Huxley called the ultimate revolution, right, where we actually shift the individual and how the individual shows up, right, so that they can create these ripples and change their environments. And if you think about these three parts of the arrow, button is silence, it's an exciting time where I live. If you think about intrinsic motivation, supporting our young, right? We talked about relatedness, competence, and we talked about autonomy. Well, that's if we want to support our young, let's give them love, let's give them that relationship until they can create it themselves. Right? Let's give them the support they need to become competent, right? So they can build the tools for becoming competent. And finally, give them the encouragement to go out there and be themselves, create the future, take ownership of Spaceship Earth. Because as Marshall McLuhan said, they're no passengers in Spaceship Earth, we're all crew. So please use education and create the future.